"Ammo check," Whitfield said into his radio, and the silence that answered him was the worst sound he'd heard all year. It stretched 2 seconds, 3 long enough for his stomach to drop before anyone even spoke. Petty Officer Danny Reyes was slumped against the boulder to his left, a tourniquet cinched high on his thigh, the fabric dark and soaked through in a way that told Whitfield everything the medic hadn't said out loud yet. His face had gone the color of old paper, pale and thin-looking, sweat beaded along his hairline despite the cold. Reyes tried to grin. It came out as a grimace, his lips pulling back tight over clenched teeth. "I got harsh language left, Master Chief, that's about it." Nobody laughed. The mortar rounds walking up the slope weren't leaving room for laughing, each impact a little closer than the last. The ground shuddering underneath them like something enormous was packing just out of sight. 6 men had come up this mountain at 200, moving quiet under a sky full of stars that had long since disappeared behind cloud. 4 were still breathing, and Whitfield tried not to let his mind wander toward the 2 who weren't, because there would be time for that later, hours from now, if there was a later at all. The insurgent force below them had grown from a handful of scouts into something closer to 60 fighters, and they had brought mortars, which meant somebody down there had been planning this for longer than anyone back at the operations center wanted to admit. This wasn't bad luck. This was a trap they had walked into with their eyes open, and now the door had closed behind them. Whitfield keyed his radio again, his voice flat, stripped of everything but the facts, because panic in his voice would spread through the whole net faster than any enemy round could travel. "Any station, this is Ghost 6. We are danger close, taking effective fire from 3 directions. We need air now." The response, when it came, was not the answer he needed, and he felt the words land somewhere low in his chest before his mind had fully processed them. A voice thick with apology crackled through the static, the kind of apology that came from someone safe behind a desk who genuinely wished he had better news to give. "Ghost 6, be advised, ceiling is at 400 feet across the whole range. Fixed wing can't get eyes on you. We are working rotary options, but ETA is unknown." Whitfield closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. That was all he allowed himself, 1 breath, 1 moment to feel the full weight of it before he had to put it away and keep functioning. Then he opened them and looked at Reyes bleeding out against the rock, his breathing already shallow and fast, and he understood, with a cold, clean clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that unknown probably meant never. 200 miles south, in a cramped, ready room that smelled like burnt coffee and jet fuel, Captain Mara Delgado was staring at a weather map that made absolutely no sense, tracing the contour lines with 1 finger like she might find a loophole hidden somewhere in the isobars. Every screen in the building agreed on one thing: nothing was flying into those mountains today. The cloud deck sat like a lid over the entire valley system, thick and gray and stitched through with turbulence that had already turned back 2 Apache helicopters, their crews returning grim-faced and shaking their heads before the debrief even started. She had flown 3 combat tours in the A-10 Thunderbolt, logged more hours in bad weather than most pilots logged total, and she had never once heard a weather brief this flatly discouraging, delivered in a tone that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "Say again the ceiling," she said, and the intelligence officer repeated it, slower this time, as if she hadn't heard him the first time, as if the number itself might change if he just enunciated it more carefully. 400 feet. In mountains that reached 9,000, it wasn't flying weather. It was a suicide brief dressed up in meteorological language, numbers on a page that translated in practical terms into a very short flight followed by a very sudden stop. Delgado's call sign was Reaper, earned 2 deployments ago after a mission nobody liked to talk about in detail, the kind of story that got told in fragments over drinks and never all at once. Right now Reaper was doing math in her head that the weather officer clearly wasn't doing, math that involved terrain elevation and cloud base and the narrow margins that separated a bold flight from a fatal one. The radio in the corner of the room crackled with the same transmission that had reached the operations center, the words "danger close" hanging in the air of the ready room like smoke that wouldn't clear. The radio in the corner of the room crackled with the same transmission that had reached the operations center. A SEAL team, danger close, taking fire from 3 sides, no air support available, 4 men and dwindling ammunition against a force that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Delgado didn't need to hear the coordinates twice. She had studied that terrain for 3 weeks straight, memorizing every ridgeline and draw for a mission that had been scrubbed twice already, the paperwork sitting dead in a folder she'd refused to throw away. She knew that valley the way most people know their own street, knew which walls narrowed and which drew wide, knew where the rock jutted out just enough to catch a wingtip if you weren't paying attention. She stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the concrete floor, the sound sharp enough that 3 other pilots in the room turned to look at her. "I can get in there," she said, and the words came out steadier than she expected, considering what she was actually proposing. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone says something everyone else is thinking, but nobody wants to be the one who said it, a silence thick enough to feel against your skin. The squadron commander, a heavy-set man named Colonel Trent Ashworth, looked at her like she had just suggested flying to the moon on a lawn chair, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. Negative, Reaper. That valley is a box canyon with weather sitting on top of it. You go low, you've got zero margin for a mechanical issue, zero margin for anything. I'm not sending a pilot into a coffin. His voice had the particular sharpness of a commander who had written too many letters to too many families and had no intention of writing another one today. Then don't send me, Delgado said, and something in her voice made the room stop breathing for a second, every conversation in the ready room dying mid-sentence. Let me volunteer. She had run those approach lines in the simulator so many times the terrain existed behind her eyelids now, every draw and false ridge memorized down to the meter, a mental map so detailed she could have drawn it blind. She wasn't asking permission out of formality. She genuinely believed she could put the jet through a gap in that weather nobody else had noticed, a narrow seam along the eastern wall where the valley pinched down and the clouds sat just a little higher, thin enough to see rock through, a detail she had clocked weeks ago and filed away for exactly a moment like this one. Ashworth rubbed his face with both hands, the way men do when they already know they're going to say yes and hate themselves for it, his palms dragging down over tired eyes. There are 4 Americans up there, he said mostly to himself, the words coming out low and heavy. And one of them is bleeding out on a mountain because we couldn't get a helicopter through. He looked at Delgado for a long 3 seconds, searching her face for the fear he expected to find there and coming up empty. You fly that seem wrong by even 10 meters, you put a $40 million airplane and yourself into solid granite, and I have to write 4 letters instead of doing something about the ones we can still save. His voice cracked slightly on the word letters, the closest he'd come all morning to showing exactly how much this decision was costing him. I won't fly it wrong, Delgado said. It wasn't bravado. It was the particular quiet certainty of a pilot who has already run the numbers 100 times before saying them out loud, who had spent 3 sleepless weeks preparing for a mission she hadn't even known she'd fly today. Ashworth exhaled through his nose, a long, slow sound like air leaking from a tire, the fight visibly draining out of him as the clock kept running somewhere far to the north. Get suited up, he said finally. You've got 1 pass to prove me right, Reaper. After that, if the weather closes the gap behind you, you're either landing on that ridge or you're not landing at all. Delgado was already moving before he finished the sentence, boots hitting the concrete hard and fast, her mind already 3 steps ahead in the cockpit. Back on the mountain, Whitfield was down to a single working weapon and a growing certainty that the sun would rise and set on this ridge without any of them seeing it happen twice. The cold had settled into his bones hours ago, but he barely noticed it anymore, his body running on something colder and more urgent than temperature. Ray's had gone quiet, his breathing shallow and fast, the tourniquet doing what it could against damage that needed a real hospital, not a rock and a prayer, and every few seconds Whitfield glanced sideways just to confirm his chest was still rising. Petty Officer Marcus Kimbrell was working the radio with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, repeating coordinates into a system that kept promising help was coming without ever saying when, his voice fraying a little more with every transmission that came back vague. The insurgent fighters had figured out the SEALs were nearly out of ammunition. You could tell by the way their movement had changed, from cautious to almost casual, men standing up behind cover they didn't need anymore because the return fire had slowed to almost nothing, their silhouettes bold against the gray morning in a way that would have been suicidal an hour earlier. A rocket-propelled grenade impacted 20 meters below their position, close enough that grit and pulverized rock rained down over Whitfield's shoulders, the concussion pressing against his eardrums like a hand shoving him sideways. He spat dust out of his mouth and thought with a strange detached clarity that this was probably how it ended, not with a bang, with a slow tightening circle minute by minute until there was simply nowhere left to retreat. Go 6, this is Overwatch. A new voice broke through the static, tight and businesslike, cutting cleanly through the noise of gunfire crackling in the background. We have a fixed-wing asset inbound, call sign Reaper, single ship, ETA 11 minutes, be advised weather is severe. This is a volunteer flight, repeat volunteer flight. Whitfield stared at his radio like it had just spoken in a foreign language, the words taking a full second to arrange themselves into something he understood. 11 minutes. He looked at Ray's, whose lips had gone the pale blue color that meant the body was starting to make hard decisions about where the remaining blood needed to go, prioritizing organs over extremities in a quiet triage nobody had asked for. 11 minutes felt like a number pulled from a different universe, one where time moved slower and mattered less, one that had nothing to do with the mountain they were actually standing on. Copy Overwatch, Whitfield said, and something in his chest loosened just slightly, just enough to notice, a small crack of light in a morning that had offered none. He keyed the radio to Kimbrell's channel. We've got a jet inbound, 11 mics, we just need to hold 11 minutes. Kimbrel nodded without looking up from the machine gun he was babying along on its last belt of ammunition, feeding it single-controlled bursts instead of the long sustained fire the moment seemed to demand. 11 minutes sounded short when you said it out loud, the kind of number that vanished in a normal day without you even noticing it passing. It sounded like an eternity when the enemy was 50 meters away and closing, and your best weapon was down to single-digit rounds, each one suddenly feeling like it carried the weight of an entire war. In the cockpit of her A-10, Delgado pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar shudder of the twin engines answering her, a vibration that traveled up through the seat and into her spine like something alive waking up beneath her. The Warthog wasn't fast, wasn't sleek, wasn't anybody's idea of a beautiful aircraft, its blunt nose and thick armored belly built for survival rather than style. It was built like a flying tank around a 30mm cannon the size of a small car, designed by engineers who had decided the pilot's survival mattered more than elegant lines, an ugly, brutal answer to a problem elegant aircraft couldn't solve. Right now, ugly and slow felt exactly like what the moment required. She leveled out at low altitude, scanning the horizon where gray mountains disappeared into a solid gray ceiling that looked less like weather and more like a wall somebody had built specifically to stop her, a physical barrier daring her to test it. The valley opened up ahead of her exactly the way it had in 3 weeks of simulator runs, every ridge and shadow matching the mental map she'd built so carefully, and for one heart-stopping second the seam she was counting on wasn't there at all. Just cloud, thick and unbroken, sitting on the ridgeline like a lid pressed down tight, and for that single second her whole plan collapsed into something close to panic. Her pulse spiked, a hard, fast drum against her ribs. Then off to the east, a thin gray thread of visibility opened between two peaks, exactly where her memorized terrain map said it should be, exactly the width she had calculated with a ruler and a stopwatch back in the ready room, a margin so narrow it barely deserved the word gap. It wasn't a door, it was barely a crack, a sliver of mercy carved into an otherwise solid wall of weather. She pushed the nose toward it anyway, both hands steady on the controls even as her heart hammered. Reaper Overwatch, be advised, ground team reports enemy within 30 meters of their position. They are danger close, repeat danger close. Delgado's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping visibly along her cheek. Danger close meant the weapon she was about to use, the massive cannon slung under her fuselage, would be firing close enough to friendly forces that a small miscalculation turned rescue into tragedy, that the line between saving 4 men and killing them collapsed down to a matter of meters. She had done this before in daylight and clear skies with every advantage stacked in her favor, the terrain visible and the wind calm and nothing between her and the target but air. Today she had none of that. She had a crack in the clouds and 4 Americans running out of time on a mountain she could not yet see, flying half on instruments and half on faith that her memory of the terrain hadn't failed her. The jet bucked hard as she entered the gap, turbulence slamming the airframe sideways with a violence that made the whole cockpit rattle, loose gear in the seat pockets clattering audibly over the roar of the engines. Rock wall flashed past close enough on her left that she could see individual boulders, moss clinging to shadowed crevices, close enough that her hands went white-knuckled on the stick without her consciously deciding to grip it that hard. This was the part of flying nobody glamorized in recruiting posters, the part where survival came down to muscle memory built over a decade and a willingness to trust instruments over instinct when your instincts were screaming to pull up and away from certain death, every nerve in her body arguing against the exact thing she was doing. Down on the ridge, Whitfield heard it before he saw anything. A low guttural growl rolling down the valley, distinct from the crack of gunfire and the thump of mortars, a sound that didn't belong to this mountain or this war until suddenly it did, growing louder with every passing second until it seemed to fill the whole gray sky. Kimbrel's head snapped up, his hands going still on the machine gun for the first time in an hour. "You hear that?" he said, and Whitfield didn't answer because he was already scanning the gray sky, searching for the source of a noise that sounded less like an engine and more like something ancient waking up. The insurgent fighters below them had gone still too, heads tilting upward, weapons pausing mid-movement, a collective hesitation that lasted only a second but felt, from the ridge, like an eternity of borrowed time. Then the A-10 screamed over the ridge, low enough that Whitfield felt the wash of hot exhaust across his face, the sudden heat and pressure of it almost knocking him sideways, close enough to see the pilot's helmet through the canopy for one fractured half-second before the jet was past, and banking hard into a turn that seemed to defy the geometry of the valley walls around it, the airframe tilting at an angle that looked impossible from the ground. Nobody on that mountain cheered. There wasn't time to cheer, and after everything they'd survived that morning, cheering felt like tempting fate before the story had actually finished. But something shifted in the air, a collective exhale from 4 exhausted men who had stopped believing help was actually coming, and now had to recalibrate everything they had already accepted as fact, the certainty of their own deaths suddenly, impossibly, no longer certain at all. "Ghost 6, Reaper, I have your smoke, I am inbound hot, keep your heads down." Delgado's voice came through clean and steady, none of the strain she was actually feeling in the cockpit bleeding into her transmission, years of training holding her voice level even as her hands fought the turbulence. She had rolled the jet onto a firing line that threaded between the ridge where the SEALs were dug in and the slope below where the fighters were massing, a margin so thin it would have been reckless in perfect weather, let alone with clouds still clawing at her wingtips, gray tendrils of it curling past the canopy like something trying to pull her back. She squeezed the trigger and the cannon beneath the jet spoke in its own unmistakable language, a sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times over, a noise that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mechanics, something almost primal. The GAU-8 Avenger fired at a rate that turned individual rounds into a continuous roar, a sound so dense and sustained it stopped feeling like gunfire and started feeling like weather itself, and the effect on the ground below was immediate and absolute. 30mm rounds tore through the slope where the insurgent fighters had gathered, and the casual confidence they had carried moments earlier collapsed into chaos and retreat, men scrambling for cover that simply wasn't there anymore. Whitfield watched from his position as men who had been closing in with something close to leisure suddenly scattered like startled birds, diving for cover that the cannon fire was systematically eliminating meter by meter, the entire slope erupting in a line of impacts that walked across the ground like something drawn with a ruler. He had called in air support before. He had never seen anything hit this hard, this precisely, with this little room for error, and for a moment he simply stared, forgetting to breathe. Splash! Delgado called out, pulling the jet up and back into a climbing turn that took her briefly above the ceiling before she had to descend again to maintain contact with the ground, the sudden burst of gray light above the clouds disorienting for half a second before she pushed back down into the gloom. Fuel was already a concern in her calculations, a quiet ticking clock she was managing alongside everything else, the needle creeping toward a number she didn't want to think about yet, but right now that math could wait. She rolled back into the valley for a second pass, watching her instruments, watching the terrain, watching a battlefield she could barely see clearly enough to trust her own eyes over her memorized coordinates, and the calm voice of the SEAL team leader feeding her updated positions with a steadiness that matched her own. Reaper, Ghost 6, good hits. They're pulling back to the tree line. We have eyes on approximately 15 remaining. They're regrouping about 200 meters southeast of our position. Whitfield's voice had changed in the space of one gun run, the flat, exhausted resignation replaced by something sharper, more focused. The sound of a man who suddenly had a reason to keep fighting instead of simply enduring, adrenaline sharpening every word. He looked over at Reyes, whose eyes had fluttered open at the sound of the cannon fire, confusion and something like hope crossing his pale face for the first time in an hour, his lips moving slightly like he was trying to ask a question his body didn't have the strength to finish. Copy, Ghost 6 coming back around. Delgado banked the jet hard, feeling the airframe protest the aggressive maneuver at low altitude, a groan running through the metal that she felt more than heard, feeling the weather pressing down around her like a hand trying to push the aircraft into the rocks, patient and unrelenting. She had maybe 6 more minutes before her fuel state forced a decision, a hard line she would not be able to argue her way past no matter how much the situation on the ground demanded otherwise, and she was not going to let this be a one-pass rescue that left the ground team fighting the exact same fight 10 minutes later. She lined up on the retreating fighters and squeezed the trigger again, the cannon roaring its answer across the valley, echoing off rock walls in a sound that seemed to shake the mountain itself, rolling and multiplying until it felt like the whole valley was firing back at once. On the ground, Kimbrell had stopped shaking, his hands finally steady on the machine gun he no longer needed to fire. He watched the cannon fire tear into the tree line with an expression somewhere between disbelief and something close to reverence, the particular look of a man witnessing a rescue he had genuinely stopped expecting an hour ago, when hope had felt like a luxury none of them could afford. That pilot just flew through weather that grounded 2 helicopters, he said, mostly to himself, mostly because saying it out loud made it feel more real, made it feel like something that had actually happened and not something he'd imagined out of pure desperation. Whitfield didn't answer. He was already moving, dragging Reyes toward better cover now that the immediate pressure had lifted, buying precious minutes that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier, his arms burning under the strain but not caring at all. Reyes coughed, a wet sound that worried Whitfield more than anything the enemy had thrown at them all morning, a sound that came from somewhere deep and damaged. "Tell the flyboy I said thanks," Reyes managed, his voice thin but his grin somehow finding its way back onto his face, stubborn and crooked despite everything. Fly girl, Whitfield corrected, glancing up at the sky where the A-10 was banking for another pass, its distinctive silhouette briefly visible through a thin patch in the cloud before disappearing again into gray, swallowed whole, and then reappearing like something that refused to stay hidden. Whatever pilot was up there flying through weather that should have kept every fixed-wing asset grounded for the day, they had bought Ray's time he desperately needed, and time was the only currency that mattered right now, more valuable in that moment than any amount of ammunition. Delgado's fuel gauge was edging toward numbers that demanded attention, the needle sitting in territory she'd flagged mentally as the point where she'd have to start thinking seriously about getting home, but she pushed one more consideration ahead of the math. The tree line where the fighters had retreated wasn't a safe distance anymore. It was a staging ground, and she knew from 3 tours of experience that a regrouped enemy force was more dangerous than a scattered one, that giving them even 10 minutes to reorganize could undo everything the last 2 passes had accomplished. She keyed her radio. "Go 6, Reaper, I've got enough gas for one more run, then I need to think about getting out of this valley before the weather closes behind me. Make it count." Whitfield's response came back immediate and certain, no hesitation at all in his voice. "Copy, Reaper, danger close, 30 meters, do it." That was the kind of call that separated a good ground controller from a great one, the willingness to accept risk that close to his own position because the alternative was worse, a calculation Whitfield made in less than a second and never once second-guessed. Delgado didn't hesitate either. She rolled the jet into her final firing pass, watching her instruments with one part of her brain while the other part tracked the terrain rushing past outside her canopy, close enough now that the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing, the rock walls close enough that a single wrong input would end everything instantly. She squeezed the trigger and held it, the cannon roaring one last time, 30mm rounds walking directly through the position where the surviving fighters had tried to make their stand, the entire tree line erupting in a rippling line of impacts and smoke. When she pulled up out of the run, the valley below had gone quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet all morning, a silence so sudden it felt almost unnatural after everything that had come before. No return fire, no mortars, just smoke drifting up from the tree line and 4 exhausted Americans on a ridge who were, against every likelihood the weather brief had suggested that morning, still alive, still breathing, still theirs to bring home. "Go 6, Reaper, how copy status?" Whitfield's voice came back rough but steady, carrying an exhaustion that had finally, blessedly, started to soften into something closer to relief. "Reaper, Ghost 6, be advised, enemy contact has ceased. We have 1 urgent casualty requiring immediate medevac, but we are no longer taking effective fire. You saved our lives up here, all 4 of us." Delgado felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched, a tension that had been building since the moment she volunteered in that ready room, muscles she didn't know were tight finally beginning to release. She checked her fuel again, the number lower than she liked but still workable if she found her way out of the valley without wasting another minute on maneuvers she didn't need, and she allowed herself one small breath of relief before pushing the thought aside to focus on the flight home. "Copy, Ghost 6, good to hear. I'm bingo fuel heading out. Medevac is already inbound behind me. Where they're supposed to be lifting west to east, they should have a window in the next 20 minutes. She banked the jet toward the seam in the clouds that had let her in, hoping it hadn't closed shut in the time she'd spent below the ceiling, praying silently in a way she rarely allowed herself during a mission. The gap was still there when she found it, narrower than before but passable, a shrinking window that seemed almost reluctant to let her back out, and she threaded the A-10 through it with the same careful precision she'd used coming in, rock walls flashing past close enough to remind her exactly how little room the day had given her. Once clear of the mountains, the weather opened up into something resembling normal visibility, the gray thinning out into pale washed light that felt almost gentle after the violence of the last 20 minutes, and Delgado allowed herself one long breath, the first full breath she'd taken since the ready room. Behind her, on a ridge she would probably think about for the rest of her career, 4 men were alive who had, 20 minutes earlier, been counting down what they assumed were their final minutes on this earth. The medevac helicopter found its window exactly when Delgado had predicted, dropping through a break in the clouds to land on a flat patch of rock 200 meters from the SEAL team's position, its rotor wash kicking up a storm of dust and loose gravel across the ridge. Whitfield and Kimbrell carried Rays between them, moving as fast as the terrain allowed, every step a fresh reminder of how close the morning had come to ending differently, their boots sliding on loose rock as they half-carried, half-dragged their teammate toward the waiting aircraft. Rays was talking now, low and slurred but talking, a good sign after the silence that had worried them both so badly, asking questions about the jet, about the pilot, about whether anyone had gotten a name to go with the call sign that had just saved his life from 400 meters up in weather nobody thought was flyable. Reaper, Kimbrel told him, hoisting him up into the helicopter with the flight medic already moving to take over, gloved hands checking the tourniquet and calling out vitals to the crew chief over the noise of the rotors. Some pilot named Reaper flew through weather that grounded 2 Apache to get to us. Reyes managed something close to a laugh despite the pain, a rough, exhausted sound that carried more relief than humor, his eyes already starting to drift as the adrenaline that had kept him conscious began to fade now that safety was finally real. "Remind me to buy Reaper a beer," he said, and then the medic was working on him and the helicopter was lifting off, dust and rock scattering beneath it, and Whitfield stood on the ridge watching it climb away into a sky that, 20 minutes ago, had felt like the ceiling of their grave. Back at the airbase, Delgado brought the A-10 down onto the runway with the careful precision of a pilot running on adrenaline and very little fuel, her hands steady out of pure habit even though every part of her body wanted to shake now that the flying was finally done, the tires chirping against pavement in a sound that felt, for one strange second, louder than the cannon fire that had defined the last hour of her life. She taxied to her parking spot and shut down the engines, the whine winding down into silence, and for a moment she simply sat in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, letting the silence settle over her the way it always did after a mission that could have ended so many different ways, replaying the narrow gap in the clouds one more time in her mind just to be sure it had actually been real. Colonel Ashworth was waiting on the tarmac when she climbed down the ladder, his expression unreadable in a way that told her he'd been standing there the entire flight, watching the radio traffic, doing the same math she'd been doing at 4,500 feet, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets against a cold he probably hadn't even felt until just now. "4 Americans," he said before she'd even pulled her helmet fully off, his voice carrying the particular rough edge of a man who had been holding his breath for the better part of an hour. "All 4 made it out. The wounded one's stable. Medics say he'll keep the leg." Delgado nodded, exhaustion finally catching up to her now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, her legs suddenly heavier than they'd been all morning. "I told you I could thread it," she said, and Ashworth actually laughed, a short surprised bark of a sound that broke the tension he'd clearly been carrying all morning. "You threaded a gap in that weather that our own forecasters said didn't exist," he said, shaking his head slowly, something between disbelief and pride settling into his weathered face. "I'm going to have a hell of a time writing this one up without it sounding like fiction." Delgado pulled off her gloves, one finger at a time, looking back toward the mountains still visible in the distance, gray and indifferent and utterly unaware of what had just happened in the narrow valley cut into their center, standing exactly as they had for 1,000 years before this morning and would for 1,000 years after. "Write it up however you need to," she said. "Just make sure it says the ground team held their position for 11 minutes against 60 fighters with almost no ammunition left. That's the part that actually matters." 3 days later, Whitfield sat in a hospital waiting room with Kimbrel, both men freshly showered and still moving with the careful stiffness of bodies that had spent too many hours pressed against cold rock, muscles that ached in places they hadn't known could ache. Reyes was in surgery, the kind of routine follow-up procedure that felt almost boring compared to what they'd survived on that ridge, and the mundane normalcy of it, the fluorescent lights and vending machine coffee and quiet hospital chatter, felt like its own small miracle after a morning that had nearly ended everything for all 4 of them. Whitfield kept thinking about the sound the jet made coming over the ridge, that low guttural growl that had changed the entire shape of the day, a sound he suspected he would hear in quiet moments for years to come. A nurse walked past with a clipboard, her sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor, and Whitfield caught himself listening for engine noise that wasn't there, a reflex his brain hadn't fully let go of yet, some part of him still scanning the sky out of habit. Kimbrel noticed him do it and said nothing, because he understood exactly what was happening, having caught himself doing the same thing twice already that morning. Some sounds rewire something in you permanently, and the sound of a cannon that saves your life tends to stay lodged somewhere behind your ribs long after the mission debrief is filed and forgot, resurfacing at odd moments for the rest of a person's life. "You think we'll ever meet her?" Kimbrel asked, and Whitfield shrugged, though the honest answer was that he hoped so more than he'd admit out loud, more than made sense for a man who didn't even know her actual name yet. 2 weeks later, at a small ceremony that nobody outside the unit would ever hear about, held in a plain room with folding chairs and lukewarm coffee that nobody complained about, Whitfield finally shook the hand of the pilot who had screamed over that ridge when hope had all but run out. Delgado was shorter than he expected, quieter too, the kind of understated presence that gave away nothing about the nerve required to fly a jet through a 400-foot ceiling in mountains that killed careless pilots on clear days. "Master Sergeant," she said, offering her hand with a firm grip that surprised him slightly, and he corrected himself instantly, unable to hold back a small smile. "Ray's wanted me to buy you a beer," he said instead, and something in her expression finally cracked into a real smile, the professional composure slipping for just a second into something warmer. "Tell him I'll take him up on that," Delgado said, "once he's off the crutches." Ray's, sitting nearby in a wheelchair with his leg elevated and a grin that hadn't faded since the surgery confirmed he'd keep the limb, called out from across the room, his voice carrying easily over the quiet murmur of conversation. "I'm buying 2 rounds, Reaper, that's non-negotiable." The room laughed, the easy, relaxed laughter of people who understood exactly how close they'd come to a very different outcome, and how rare it was to get the chance to laugh about it together afterward, instead of at a memorial service, with someone else's name being read aloud into a silent room full of folded flags. What stayed with Whitfield longest wasn't the mortar fire, or the dwindling ammunition count, or even the 11 minutes that had felt like 11 years stretched thin across a gray morning sky. It was the moment the jet screamed over the ridge, low and impossible and exactly on time, proof that somewhere above the clouds someone had decided 4 strangers on a mountain were worth flying into weather that had grounded every other aircraft in the theater. That was the part of the story he found himself telling over and over at reunions at bars to his own kids years later, not because it was the most dramatic detail, but because it was the one that reminded him what people were capable of when the math said stay grounded and they went anyway, when the safe choice would have cost 4 lives and somebody decided that price was too high to pay. Delgado never talked much about that mission afterward, not because she didn't think about it, but because in her mind the story had never really been about her, had never been about the flying at all when you got down to what actually mattered. It was about a gap in the clouds that shouldn't have been wide enough, and a pilot willing to bet everything on 3 weeks of memorized terrain, and 4 men on a ridge who held their position with almost nothing left because giving up simply wasn't a decision any of them were built to make, not that morning, not with each other still breathing beside them. When people asked her later what it felt like flying through weather that grounded everyone else, she usually gave the same short answer, delivered without a trace of drama. It felt like the only thing to do. If this story pulled you in the way it pulled us in writing it, you already understand why these missions matter, why the people who fly into the weather nobody else will touch deserve to have their stories told, remembered, passed along to someone who hasn't heard them yet. It follows so you don't miss the next one because there are more mountains out there, more ridges, more men and women who refuse to let the math decide the ending. Somewhere right now, another crew is studying a weather map that says impossible, tracing the same stubborn lines Delgado once traced, and somewhere else, a team on the ground is holding on, counting rounds, watching the sky, hoping someone screams over the ridge in time. That's the story worth coming back for.